Jonathan Blake didn't believe in fate until the day 3 unfamiliar little girls appeared, holding the necklace he once gave to the woman who vanished from his life. When a glance from the past collided with the present, a truth buried for 6 years surged to the surface. Can a man who built his life on logic find the courage to step into the hearts of 3 children and a mother who once lost all hope? Jonathan Blake didn't believe in fate. His entire life was a perfectly crafted blueprint. Work, gym hours, meals, and billion-dollar deals, all scheduled down to the minute. He never did coincidences, and that morning was no different, or so he thought. His flight to New York had been delayed due to weather. His assistant quickly booked him a room at the very hotel he owned in downtown Seattle. A minor change, a slight annoyance, nothing worth noting, until 3 little girls appeared. He was sitting in the ground floor lounge, holding a coffee he hadn't sipped, his eyes quietly fixed on the large glass window reflecting the damp, early morning city. No emails, no calls, no meetings intruding on this empty moment. It felt so unfamiliar it bordered on unsettling. And then, a small voice, like a question from a dream, sounded beside him. "Excuse me, mister, have you seen a necklace like this?" He turned his head, and time seemed to stop. 3 little girls, about 6 years old, blonde hair tied in identical braids, stood close together in a neat little row in front of him. Big, round eyes, expressions both cautious and curious. The girl in the middle held out a silver necklace that glinted in the morning light. A small heart, thin, simple. He'd touched that necklace hundreds of times. He'd picked it out himself, engraved an E on the back, placed it around a woman's neck on a quiet birthday night. A woman he could never forget. Emily. The necklace he thought had vanished with her 6 years ago, along with every promise, every plan, every hope he'd once believed in. Jonathan felt his chest tighten, not because the past was rushing back, but because the present was shifting right before his eyes. Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice deeper than he'd expected. "It's our mom's," the girl on the left answered, her eyes never leaving him. "She said it was from someone special, but we never met him." He swallowed the lump in his throat, carefully kept his face composed, though inside it felt like a tidal wave was crashing. "What's your mom's name?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. The 3 girls glanced at each other. A brief pause, then the girl on the right whispered, her voice small like a secret, "Emily Carter." The world he knew shattered in a single note. The surrounding sounds faded. The background music, the coffee machine, the typing at the reception desk, all blurred into meaningless noise. Only the 3 children in front of him remained, and that name. The name that had lain dormant in him for 6 years, now flaring up like wildfire. Emily. Emily Carter, the woman he'd once thought would be his family, the woman who'd disappeared without a word, no message, no letter, no trace. And now 3 tiny versions of her and of him stood before him. He began to see it, not just their mother's blonde hair, but the details he couldn't ignore. Soft brown eyes with a sharp gaze, exactly like the one he used to scrutinize contracts. The shape of their eyebrows, the way they pursed their lips when thinking. Small details that hurt to notice. "Is your mom here now?" he asked, his voice lower. The girl in the middle nodded. "She's checking in. We came to sit while she talks to the lady at the desk." He stood up slowly. It felt like every muscle in his body was taut, strained. His mind was a storm. He didn't know if he could face Emily without breaking, but he knew one thing for certain: he had to see her. He glanced toward the reception desk, and then he saw her, Emily, standing there no more than 10 meters away, her hair longer, darker, a simple coat, a face once so familiar, now both strange and achingly known. She was saying something to the clerk, her body slightly leaning forward, still that habit when she tried to seem gentle. He remembered it well. Then she turned. Her gaze swept across the lobby. She saw him. She froze, as if slapped by memory. Her hand tightened around her bag's strap. Her eyes widened, not with joy, but with fear, guilt. Neither of them moved. That look, 6 years, and now, in a single moment, it all came rushing back. Jonathan took a deep breath and stepped toward her, like a man walking through fog. His heart pounded like a hammer in his chest, but this time, he wasn't running away. Emily didn't run, but she didn't step forward either. She just stood there, as if her body had forgotten how to move, her gaze trapped between the past and the present, between the man she once loved and the man standing before her now. Jonathan stopped a few steps away. He could see her face clearly, guarded eyes, lips pressed together as if swallowing a tidal wave. Emily. He called her name, and the moment it left his lips, he knew. He'd never stopped missing it. She nodded faintly, a silent confirmation that this wasn't an illusion. "Hi, John," she replied, her voice soft like a breeze skimming the sea, so gentle it almost didn't feel real. He didn't know where to begin. Hundreds of questions lined up in his mind, some sharp like knives, others soft like old memories, but they all clogged in his throat. "It's those 3 kids," he said, as if not saying it would make them vanish. "There." Emily lowered her head. A long moment passed before she looked up, and in her eyes there was no denial, no excuses, just honest surrender. "Yes," she said quietly. "They're yours." No shock, no tearing sound, but Jonathan felt his entire inner world collapse in silence, not out of anger, but because of an old pain that had never been allowed to heal. "You weren't going to tell me anything?" His voice stayed calm, but each word struck like a hammer on stone. Emily bit her lip, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "Back then I was scared," she admitted. "I didn't think you'd choose us. I thought your career was everything. I didn't want to be a burden." Jonathan let out a laugh, not a joyful one. It was the laugh of a man whose last layer of skin had just been peeled away. "You thought I'd see my own kids as a burden?" "Not because of them, John. Because of me." He looked at her, trying to pin down the image of the girl he once knew, only to realize she'd been gone for a long time. "You were everything to me, Emily. Everything." His voice was low, heavy with regret. "If I'd known, do you think I'd have walked away?" Emily fell silent. In her eyes was a struggle that had stretched across years, now breaking into pieces. "I looked for you," he continued, his voice now almost a whisper. "I searched for you like a madman, hired people, dug through the past. Nothing, no trace. I thought you were dead." She closed her eyes, her cheek trembled slightly. "I didn't know how to come back," she said. "Whether they were born, everything became a whirlwind. I built a little world. I was afraid that if I showed up in yours again, it would all be erased." He stepped closer, not threatening, not accusing, just carrying the pain of a father who'd never known he was one. "You decided for both of us. You didn't give me a chance, not a single word." "I know," Emily whispered, "and I don't have any excuses. Just one thing. I never hated you. I never wanted to hurt you. I just made the wrong choice." They stood in a long silence. Jonathan glanced at the 3 little girls sitting and playing together, giggling, holding a scribbled piece of paper. Their innocent brushstrokes seemed to sketch out all the years he lost. "I missed everything," he said softly. "Their first steps, their first words, midnight dreams, morning hugs, every moment that you got to have." Emily turned away, but not fast enough to hide the tears spilling from her eyes. "I didn't want you to hurt," she choked out, "but I know I took more from you than I ever lost." Jonathan didn't cry, but inside something cracked. "I'm not angry at you, Emily," he said, surprising even himself with the truth of it. "I just regret. It hurts, not for me, but for them, for the years I wasn't there." She turned back to him, her eyes red, no more hiding. "I don't know where to start again." He answered with words that were almost a breath. "From now, Jonathan didn't know how to start, but he knew one thing. He wasn't leaving. Not after seeing those 3 pairs of eyes. Not after learning there were 3 little hearts out there he'd never known existed, and especially not after realizing they were his. The next morning he returned to the hotel. Not in a crisp suit or with an expensive laptop, like usual. Instead, he carried 2 hot coffees and 3 small packages wrapped in brown paper, a box of crayons, a princess coloring book, and a plastic dinosaur model. He knocked on the door of room 804, Emily's room. The door cracked open. Emily saw him. A flicker of surprise crossed her eyes, then wariness, but she didn't close it. "I didn't know if I should come," Jonathan said, his voice softer than it ever was in boardroom negotiation. "But I thought I should try." Emily glanced at the items in his hands. "They're watching cartoons," she said, her tone neutral, not quite an invitation, not quite a dismissal. Then she opened the door wider. Jonathan stepped inside. The room was small, warm, and charmingly cluttered. Tiny shoes were scattered under a chair. A stuffed bunny lay sprawled on a pillow. The faint scent of baby shampoo and cookies lingered in the air. The 3 girls were sitting on the floor, engrossed in a cartoon. When they noticed him, all 3 turned their heads, almost in unison. "Hi," he said, faltering slightly. "It's Uncle Jonathan from yesterday." They stared at him, as if sizing up a new creature entering their world. One of them, maybe Ava, tilted her head. "Did you bring something?" He chuckled, feeling a small wave of relief. "I did, but only if you share your names first." 3 voices, Ava, June, and Lily, rang out almost in harmony. Jonathan sat down and laid out the 3 gifts. There was no magic, no instant tearful bonding moment, just hesitant glances, simple questions, and 3 pairs of curious little hands fumbling with the wrapping paper. Emily stood behind them, arms crossed, leaning against the wall. She didn't intervene, but her eyes never left Jonathan. He didn't know how to draw unicorns. He had no idea which princess was in right now, and he absolutely didn't know how to respond when June asked, dead serious, "Do you know how to make cupcakes?" But he tried. He drew an elephant that Ava said looked like a cotton ball. He listened to Lily talk about her imaginary bear friend. He read a picture book even though his voice was a bit stiff, and when all 3 burst out laughing because he mispronounced a mermaid's name, he laughed too, not because he found himself funny, but because their laughter was the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard. Emily watched, her gaze softening slightly, though she kept her distance. Her mind buzzed with questions. How long would he stay? Was this just a role he was playing, or was it real? Was she letting 3 little hearts fall for someone who might disappear again? When the girls switched to a game of Prince and Princess Lost in the Forest, Ava shoved a pink plastic crown at Jonathan. "You're the king. You have to save us." He looked at the crown, then at Emily. She shrugged, not smiling, but with eyes brighter than before. He put it on. "All right," he said. "The king is ready." A few hours later, when the girls were exhausted and sprawled over each other to finish the last bit of their movie, Jonathan stood up. "I won't stay long," he said to Emily, his voice quieter. "I know everything's still a mess, but I want to get to know them, little by little." She looked at him for a moment, then gave a small nod. No promises, but a crack in a door that had been locked for years. Before leaving, he glanced at the girls again. None of them called him Dad. They just called him Uncle. But when Lily lifted her head and whispered, "Will Uncle Jonathan come back?" He didn't need any other title. "Absolutely," he said. "I promise." And for the first time in years, as he stepped out of the room, he didn't feel like he was leaving, but like he was coming home. Seattle's sky drizzled lightly all afternoon, thin droplets like mist painting a gentle blur across the living room window. In the small apartment where Emily and the 3 children were temporarily staying, the scent of crayons, hot chocolate, and children's music blended into a strangely warm atmosphere. Jonathan sat on the floor, surrounded by the 3 girls. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie long discarded, and one sleeve bore a green streak from an unsuccessful coloring session with Ava. He didn't mind. He'd never felt closer to real life than this. Emily stood in the kitchen, holding a mug of tea but watching the scene from afar. Jonathan was learning to braid June's hair, his face as focused as if he were deciphering the most complex blueprint of his life. Lily sat quietly drawing, occasionally glancing up at him as if trying to figure out who this big, gentle man was in her world. Emily smiled, without realizing she was smiling. "Uncle Jonathan?" Ava said, tugging his sleeve. "Can you dance?" Jonathan laughed, a little nervous. "I could learn, but I'd need a good teacher." All three cheered. An impromptu dance began. No rhythm, no perfection, just laughter, the thumping of little feet, and music from a phone in the corner. Jonathan tried to keep up, stumbling like a baby deer taking its first steps, and the kids roared with laughter at that. Not mocking, just joyful. Because in the child's world, the best thing isn't doing it right, it's doing it together. Then, suddenly, Lily stopped mid-dance. She looked at him, a gaze longer than usual. She held a piece of paper behind her back, then shyly handed it over. "For Daddy," she said, her voice light, as if she didn't know she'd just made the whole room hold its breath. Jonathan froze. He looked at the paper, a scribbled crayon drawing, a tall figure wearing a crown, holding hands with three smaller ones. Above each figure, a name in wobbly capital letters, Lily, June, Ava, and the one in the middle, Daddy. Emily turned, stiffening. In that moment, time seemed to shrink. Jonathan bent down, taking the drawing with both hands, as if receiving something more precious than any contract he'd ever signed. "Thank you, Lily," he said softly, his voice catching. "It's the best drawing I've ever gotten." "Not Uncle," Lily replied. She shrugged, as if it were obvious. "Daddy." Jonathan swallowed the tremor at the corner of his mouth. He didn't know how to react. There was no script in his head, just a feeling swelling so much his eyes stung. Emily stood there, gripping her cold tea, her gaze locked on them. A man trembling from a single word, and a child unaware she'd just erased the line between past and present. Lily turned away, resuming her play, as if she didn't realize she'd just changed a man's world with one word. Jonathan stood, slowly, turning to Emily. "Did you hear that?" he asked, but his voice held no blame, no pride, just humble belief. Emily nodded, her eyes red. "I'm not stopping it," she said, "but I'm not ready to call you that either." Jonathan stepped closer, keeping a safe distance, for her and for himself. "I don't need you to call me that," he said quietly. "I just need you to let me stay. With the girls. With you, if you'll allow it." Emily didn't speak, but tears fell silently. "I'm scared," she whispered, "that if I trust again, it'll all disappear." "I'm scared too," Jonathan replied. "But this time, I won't disappear. Whether you trust me or not, I'll be here, long enough for the girls to know I'm real, long enough for you to see I'm real." Emily looked at him for a long time. Her gaze was no longer guarded. It was the fragility of someone starting to believe they could trust again. She nodded, ever so slightly. "Then, stay," she said, her voice small like the rain brushing the window. "Just for today." Jonathan smiled. "Today is a good starts." And as the innocent laughter filled the room again, Emily turned to wipe her tears. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in 6 years, she didn't feel alone anymore. The small wooden house sat behind tall reeds, just a few minutes' walk from the beach. It wasn't luxurious. The old wooden floor creaked, the curtains were frayed at the edges, and the kitchen was barely big enough for one person to turn around. But for Emily, this place offered something she hadn't had in 6 years, a space to breathe, and this time she wasn't alone. Jonathan stepped into the kitchen that morning with an apron tied crookedly, holding a plate of misshapen pancakes, shaped like a whale. I tried to get creative, he said, grinning sheepishly. June said she wanted a flying fish. The three kids burst into giggles. Emily, still washing dishes, turned to look at him. In her eyes was a light that hadn't been there before, a wordless softening. The day unfolded as if written by sunlight and sea breeze. Jonathan built sandcastles with Ava, let June climb onto his shoulders to hunt for shells, and didn't complain when Lily dumped a bucket of water on his pants to rescue the stranded captain. Emily watched. She didn't interfere, but every time he bent down to brush sand off a child's knee, or patiently listened to a 10-minute imaginary story without interrupting, she felt something shifting inside her. It wasn't that he was trying to be a father, he had become one. That afternoon, as the sun softened, they spread a blanket on the grass, eating sandwiches and fruit. Lily sat in Jonathan's lap, June rested her head on Emily's shoulder, and Ava sketched a family at the beach drawing, with blue crayons sprawling across half the page. "You know," Emily said, her voice drifting like the sea breeze, "I used to imagine this scene, years ago, but in my imagination you were always a shadow, faceless." Jonathan looked at her, his gaze unhurried. "And now?" She met his eyes. "For a long time." Then quietly said, "Now, it's clearer." No more words were needed, just that. But to Jonathan, it was like a door opening from her side. Not wide, not rushed, but a real door. That night, after the kids had fallen asleep, worn out from a day full of laughter, Emily stepped onto the back porch, wrapped in a thin sweater, cradling a warm mug of tea. The wind carried the salty scent of the sea, and the waves lapped steadily against the shore, like the heartbeat of the ocean. Jonathan was already there. No laptop, no phone. Just him and the simple presence of a man who'd learned to pause. "I used to think," he said as she sat beside him, "that everything I did was for some grand purpose. But today, when Lily grabbed my hand just to point at a seagull, I realized nothing's grander than being with them." Emily stayed quiet. Then she smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered. "They trust you," she said. "And you?" She turned to him, her gaze meeting his like a calm wave. Not fierce, not dramatic, but enough to start cracking every wall inside her. "I'm learning to trust again," she said softly. "Day by day, action by action, not with words." Jonathan nodded. "Then I'll keep going with actions." A gust of wind blew through, clusters of stars reflected in their eyes like something just beginning. The final night at the beach passed slowly, as if time itself knew to linger. The children slept soundly on the sofa, still in their star and unicorn pajamas, clutching stuffed animals and half-eaten cookies. The rhythmic murmur of the waves outside was like a lullaby for the soul, gentle and endless. Jonathan stood, pulling a light blanket over the three tiny figures curled up together. He bent down, brushing Lily's hair softly, then looked up to catch Emily's gaze from the porch. She stood there, a thin coat wrapped around her, hair loose in the sea breeze. The moonlight spilled over her, making her eyes glisten like water, still but deep, soft yet not cold. He stepped out beside her, saying nothing. They stood in silence for a long while. A silence that was no longer a divide, but a space where they could both breathe. Emily spoke first. "They're happy," she said. "I've never seen them laugh this much." Jonathan turned to her. "Neither have I." She smiled. A small one. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled something out, something that gleamed under the moonlight. A silver necklace, heart-shaped, worn, familiar, full of memories. He looked at it as if time had folded in half, as if everything he'd once lost had been placed back into his hands in the form of this small thing. "I kept it," she said, her eyes fixed on the chain. "There were times I wanted to throw it away, so many times, but somehow it always came back. In an old coat pocket, in a drawer I forgot to lock, in the hands of one of the girls rummaging through old toys." Jonathan didn't speak. He simply opened his palm, an invitation that needed no explanation. Emily placed the necklace in his hand. His fingers closed around it, holding it fully. Once again, but this time, it wasn't nostalgia. It was the present. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small box. He opened it. Inside was another silver chain, the other half of the pair from long ago. A second heart, a perfect match to the one she'd just given him. "I had it made at the same time as yours," Jonathan said, his voice low but steady. "But I never got the chance to give it to you." Emily looked at the chain in his hand, then up at him. A look full of realization, of the years lost, the things that couldn't be reclaimed, and the things by some miracle still left. "And now?" she asked softly. Jonathan took a breath, not looking away. "Now? I don't want to wait anymore. I don't want to think about what should have been. I just want to build what will be." Emily fell silent. Her hand trembled slightly, but her gaze was steady. "I've lived too long in fear," she said. Afraid of being hurt, afraid of letting someone in only for them to leave again, afraid of giving the girls hope and then letting it slip away. He nodded, faintly, not interrupting, not pushing. Emily looked down at the two silver chains, two halves of a heart now resting side by side in his palm. Then she looked up. "I'm ready," she whispered, very slowly, very clearly, not to forget, but to begin. Jonathan didn't reply. He simply held out his hand. She placed hers in it, light as a breeze touching water, but firm as sand holding the steps of someone returning. In that moment, no one said, "I love you." No one promised forever. There were no rings, no wedding, nothing loud. Just a new trust beginning to bloom, like the first sprout breaking through after a long winter, not needing to shatter the earth to reach for the light. Inside, the three children slept on, and outside, the sea whispered its old story, now with a new chapter being written.